call the honourable member for Fremantle.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker, and I'm glad to have the opportunity to speak on this committee report by the Joint Standing Committee on Trade and Investment Growth. I thank its members for what is a compelling and comprehensive examination of our current and potential trade relationship with Indonesia, especially at the time when we are in the process of negotiating the Indonesia-Australia Regional Economic Partnership Agreement. The broad observations made at the outset of this report are fascinating, and they reinforce the great significance of our relationship with Indonesia, not least because Indonesia is becoming a powerhouse in the Asia-Pacific. Indonesia is the 5th largest nation by population. It has the 16th largest economy, but from the Australian perspective, we really need to hold on to the projection that Indonesia is expected to be the 4th largest economy in the world by 2050. Of course, Australia is currently the 13th largest economy, and yet our trade with Indonesia, with our next door neighbour, is such that neither country at the moment is a top 10 trading partner of the other. So that gives a sense of the potential in the trade and economic relationship between our two nations. The Shadow Minister talked about the great example provided by the Australian-Indonesian Business Council, the disparity in terms of Australian companies currently involved in Indonesia and New Zealand. New Zealand, comparatively small, 4 million, yet there are 12,000 Australian companies that have an involvement on the ground there, and only 300 in Indonesia. Another measure of that disparity is in the quantum of that investment, $86 billion worth of investment by Australian companies in New Zealand, only $11 billion by Australian companies in New Zealand. And Speaker, the committee report is also instructive in its observations about Australia's approach to trade agreements in general. And to some degree, my perspective on that, my interest is as a member of the Joint Standing Committee on Treaties. And as the Shadow Minister and the member for Bruce observed, both the J-SCOT and the J-STIG, which I'll take the liberty of calling the committee that's produced this report, are in broad agreement about some of the risks and shortcomings, both in substance and process, of the government's approach to settling preferential trade agreements. And there are 3 particular points I'd like to touch on. Independent economic analysis, the question of trade and jobs, which is really an issue that needs to be looked at a lot more closely than is currently the case, and the issue of ISDS, or investor-state dispute settlement provisions. Deputy Speaker, recommendation 4 of this report states that the final text of the Indonesia-Australia Regional Economic Partnership Agreement, which is currently in negotiation, should be accompanied by independent analysis conducted by either the Productivity Commission or an equivalent organisation. Now, in the J-SCOT report 165, which is on the Trans-Pacific Partnership, there was a similar recommendation, recommendation 2, which stated, and I quote, "The committee recommends that the Australian Government consider implementing a process through which independent modelling and analysis of a proposed trade agreement is undertaken by the Productivity Commission or equivalent organisation." In the report of the Trade References Committee of the Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade Joint Committee in June 2015, that report was called Blind Agreement, and it made a similar recommendation, recommendation 8, which says, and I quote, "The committee recommends that a cost-benefit analysis of trade agreements be undertaken by an independent body, such as the Productivity Commission, and tabled in Parliament prior to the commencement of negotiations or as soon as is practicable afterwards. The cost-benefit analysis should inform the government's approach to negotiations." So we've seen from multiple committees over several years now a clear recommendation to government, and it's a common sense one. Unfortunately, the Minister for Trade, in responding to the J-SCOT recommendation, has indicated, as the government member who spoke earlier, the member for Groom, that the government has no interest in doing that. And how can the Australian public, how can the Australian Parliament or the Australian government be confident that these agreements are what they're cracked up to be, that are worth entering into on balance, without an informed view, without a view supported by appropriate high-level independent economic analysis? Well, the answer is they can't have that confidence, and that's why we on this side of the House have been pushing for that change to be made, while those on the government side have been fiercely resisting it. It does matter because there's plentiful evidence that trade agreements tend to overpromise and underdeliver. I know that in the report 165 on the TPP, there was plentiful evidence that the assessment of a range of trade agreements in recent times has substantially overestimated the benefit that actually accrued from them. We also know that governments have a habit of talking up and misrepresenting the value of trade agreements. We've heard from this government that trade agreements are going to be enormously productive of jobs in the Australian economy when, by its nature, liberalising your economy, especially if you're a developed nation, doesn't tend to create jobs. It tends to see jobs go to areas where labour is cheaper. That's one of the things that you deal with through proper transition arrangements and by expanding your economy in other areas. The TPP was cited on numerous occasions as one of the ways in which this government was going to deliver the as yet still distant jobs and growth lift that we desperately need. There was no independent economic analysis of the TPP, so there was nothing to give us any confidence that it would be productive of jobs in the Australian economy. In fact, the only assessment of jobs that was relevant to the TPP was by a Tufts University paper that assessed that, in fact, over the first 10 years of the TPP, it would likely cost 36,000 jobs in the Australian economy. Deputy Speaker, there are two further aspects of the committee's report that I'd like to touch upon that are contained in recommendation 4 are about ISDS and the waiving of labour market testing. They both represent sort of an extension of trade agreements really outside what you'd think of as being their traditional remit. These days we talk about trade agreements, they really are trade and investment agreements, and they cover a range of other matters. In the case of ISDS, there is a real risk with those mechanisms that we cede our policy and government-making sovereignty, that we allow foreign companies to have access to tribunals to dispute Australian policy and Australian government decisions. It's effectively discrimination against Australian-based companies. It has no demonstrated benefit in terms of attracting investment, and it puts us at risk. In the case of waiving labour market testing, it means through a range of recent trade agreements that people can come in under the contractual services provider category, a category that covers some 650 professions. I think the Shadow Minister for Trade was suggesting to me the other day that in time to come that may well cover something like 70 to 75% of all jobs in Australia. There's just no justification for having an arrangement that means workers, temporary labour, can come into this country without first ensuring that there isn't Australian labour available to undertake that task. That's a simple thing. I won't say more about the report other than to again thank the members for a strong majority report, for making that recommendation strongly and clearly, that those things should be changed in both the substance and the process by which we approach, negotiate and enter into preferential trade agreements. Thank you.